Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. I keep plugging in my headphone jack in between lectures, so every time that happens, I always forget to unplug it as soon as I'm about to lecture. So I hope you all are doing well today. I'm repping Virginia Tech today due to the game last night where we squeaked by Duke. Big win for us because that usually doesn't happen in basketball. So apologies for all the Duke fans out there. But I just wanted to not only represent but also say, these are the few times that it actually happens. So I have to celebrate to some regard, and try to not rub it in per se, but like I said, celebrate a little bit. But today I want to finish my lecture on the ideology of interpersonal persuasion. So I want to talk about a couple of different areas in terms of compliance gaining, conflict, and then gender and culture, and some of the differences that have been found within research of some ideologies within persuasion. So if you want to ever talk about some of these, like you've noticed some exemplars that might match what I'm talking about, or maybe the polar opposite what I'm talking about, these are good conversation points. And, I want to mention these because they are important to consider. And again, if it's something that you figure that some of the ideologies that I'm going to be presenting are inaccurate, this may be a good opportunity to approach those in your third reflection paper. So your second one is going to be due Friday by midnight, but the third one has you deal a little bit with kind of invention of a specific theory within communication. And so that may be expansive in terms of maybe looking in terms of areas like gender or culture in this case, that you see differences in some of the things that I'm talking about. So look through your Woodward and Denton book and see if there's anything that you would say, and I don't know if this matches up from your experience and so forth. So that's going to be really important. So before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about compliance gaining. And we mentioned the notion of compliance gaining in terms of this internal versus external acceptance. And what does it mean to have external acceptance versus having a genuine attitude, thoughts, beliefs, that kind of thing within your within your cognition in this case. And so within compliance gaining, this is where we talk a lot about your first paper. And a lot of y'all had two ideas that were really solid in terms of this ideology of compliance gaining and what does it mean to accept things internally versus at face value. So this is that conversation between persuasion, manipulation, and coercion. And I'm not going to get too far into manipulation and coercion, but the two things that I'm messing up my hair here. The two things y'all talked about that I found really interesting were first and foremost the intent for the sending party. So this was a notion of persuasion where you would mention that Aristotle had this ideology of if my intent is good, that's where persuasion comes into play versus manipulation, coercion, they have alternate motives. And so that was a really good thought, and I tried to make sure that I communicated that this is a solid base for what you're looking at in terms of what does it mean for compliance gaining versus acceptance is the intent of the message. Now, with that being said, Aristotle in this case, in terms of rhetoric, is very positive in this case. So he was very for rhetoric. He kind of defied's kind of a strong word. He really spoke against Socrates in this matter because Plato in this case, because Plato would look in terms of rhetoric and say, this is not what we should be looking at when it comes to persuasion, because rhetoric is not a skill, was a bit of his argument, whereas Aristotle really thought quite the opposite in this case. So that was the one thing in terms of intent. And again, Aristotle in this case would really emphasize that intent in terms of saying the skill set needs virtue in this case. And so you might want to look through, if you're interested in this kind of thing, Aristotle's virtues really come into play here. And like I said, that's a cool list, and it really talks about something that's really heavy within virtues and something that's not as pronounced. The other thing that we're going to mention here is the notion of freedom of choice within the receiving party. And I think about half of y'all approached this ideology of freedom of choice, that within manipulation, it's kind of that illusion of freedom that you don't really have, versus coercion, you don't have any freedom at all. Whereas persuasion, in this case, you do have the aspect of choosing one way or the other. So this was kind of interesting. This actually came up in a debate with a couple of friends of mine when we were talking about Game of Thrones of, is it considered persuasion that if you don't join my particular party, something bad would happen to you? And I would say that's probably more coercion versus, if you don't join, then you're still free to go. That's a choice in this particular case. Whereas the choice presented in some of the later seasons of Game of Thrones in this case would be you join or something really bad happens. So I'm not going to say who, I'm not going to say what, I'm not going to say what families. So if you haven't watched the season, I'm going to try not to ruin it in this case. So what happens in terms of these areas of persuasion, manipulation, coercion is sometimes conflict can occur. And these are differences between others. And someone argued that we don't communicate without conflict, that everything leading up to the area of conflict in terms of agreeing, in terms of what we would call small talk, isn't communication. And that's an important consideration when you really sit back and think about it, is how much of our communication is considered kind of robotic, kind of programmed within us, that we think a certain way, that we don't really challenge our initial thought process and really think and really, again, in this case, communicate. And so, again, conflict is very important, to where some scholars would say, you don't communicate without it. You don't communicate without this differing perspective of what would be considered your own, because you're being challenged in that opinion. So, again, you may sit there, this would actually make a really good discussion post for next week. I might actually do that. Is it called communication without conflict? What do you think? And so, some of you will probably disagree with me, and that's good. That's part of what we're doing. That's conflict. It's again really important to consider within the notion of conflict. The other things that we might want to mention is understanding that different interpretations, viewpoints, may be the only way we truly learn things. This is the phenomenology perspective. That's how we learn about different things, is understanding the other side of things through the people who observe it. Again, from a phenomenology perspective, I can't understand what you all go through because I don't have that direct experience. Again, why empathy is so hard. Otherwise, it's just enforcing prior beliefs. And I know that's how a lot of people communicate with each other, is we just enforce things that are already established in terms of your thought process. We don't move. So if this is like social judgment or something, we don't move in terms of our spectrum of acceptance or rejection. We just kind of stay where we are and really hone in on that particular side. So again, is that communication? It's kind of up for you to decide in this case. But it's often looked down upon. When we think about conflict, we think about arguments, we think about fighting in this case. Conflict is also associated with argumentation. It's a negative component for a lot of people. And so we need to think about conflict management. Now, your book establishes conflict management in the way that we look at DESC in this case. So it's DESC in terms of how we approach conflict. And these aren't, one size fits all. They usually never are, but they are important to talk about. So they mention it in the 4 areas of describe, explain, specify, and the consequences. So describe in this case is explaining the fact that why are you bothered? What is it about this scenario that we're approaching that it bothers you? You're upset at something or someone. And you need to think about what is it that you're upset about in this particular case. Then you go into explaining. What are the feelings and emotions are involved with this? And so we might get into what would be considered I versus me language in this case, in terms of the way to approach this, because in many cases we don't feel comfortable if we're being accused of something. So if I feel wrong to this kind of thing versus we, me language in this case is, how we should be working together. And so, my wife and I will have our disagreements and we will have conflict. So we need to explain what is it that the other party did that made us bothered. And what are those emotions involved? Does my wife feel upset in terms of angry of something I did or saddened about something I did? And terms of specifying, that's the next part of, it's often best to share conflict in terms of what can we do in terms of trying to solve. How do we plan to resolve this conflict? So it may be that, I need to help out more around certain areas, like for instance, like maybe walking the dog or something. I need to help out a little bit more in that department, or whatever it may be. And so we specify those areas of things that we should be doing with each other. I know for my roommates and I, when I was single and in grad school, in my master's, I had some good friends that we would often talk about how do we plan to resolve it. Well, someone needs to do the dishes because we didn't have a dishwasher. So again, that was a point of why I'm bothered, because they're dirty dishes. What are the feelings involved? I'm annoyed. I'm potentially embarrassed because, we always had people that came over to our house and, having a mess in the sink. Well, that kind of ruins the mood a little bit in this case. Specify how do we plan to resolve it? Well, someone needs to do the damn dishes. And then again, what are the consequences? This is the last one within desk is consequences. What happens if nothing changes? Some changes, everything changes. So if nothing changes, you might sit there and say, well, this could be like extreme, is that you might say to somebody, well, I don't feel comfortable living with you anymore. Or I think we need to terminate the relationship. God forbid that would be the case. That would be an extreme example, but, it may be that communication is that much more uncomfortable because of it, or, there's lack of trust. If nothing changes in this case, or it's just that much more difficult of living together or being in one another's company. Granted, consequences is often associated with negative emotions, but there can definitely be positive consequences in this case. So what if everything changes? Like if I'm the guilty party in this case and I need to change what needs to be done within the conflict of what everybody's upset about in both parties. If I do something and everything changes, well, now we've got a whole different perspective. And so maybe we don't want to focus on the negatives of, maybe a termination of the relationship, or maybe, again, difficulty of what could happen, or again, lack of trust. Maybe it's that we want to focus on some more of the positive things, like there's complete trust, or maybe, you can think of a million different examples of why might someone be rewarded if they're doing what they're supposed to do. This is a good opportunity to talk about, I'm not going to go too far into depth with it, like Gary Chapman's 5 love languages and so forth, and where we go into conflict of saying, how do we express love? And I'm going to get these wrong. I always forget them, but I think it's like words of affirmation, physical touch, service, gifts, and words of affirmation, unless I repeated that first one. I'm not sure. But basically how you prefer to receive love in this case versus how you give, or how your partner or even your friend expresses that love for one another in this case. And so it may not even be romantic. It may be just that, your friends, you want to express your love within the relationship to help out with each other in terms of just friends. So what can we do? My wife, for instance, is very much a service-oriented person where, if I do a certain chore around the house, that makes her very happy because she hates clutter, for instance. It doesn't bother me as much, but she really does not like it, whereas, I'm more of a words of affirmation kind of person. And so this deals with conflict management in terms of what do we want to hear when this comes into play. So this is a major component of within conflict. Other things we can think about is how gender and culture are involved. So gender, in this case, is how we can look in terms of identity scripts of how we handle messages. Because, think about it in the sense of how our identities are constructed as we grow older. And some of us may have had a mindset of, the gender doesn't really matter as much, so much as the argument does. But the tendency is, how we're raised in terms of either being masculine or feminine in this case. And there are some research studies that deal with this ideology of how people approach conflict or persuasion if you're more masculine kind of personality versus you're more feminine. And again, if you find something and you think of something that you said, I don't think that's true, Dr. Daniel, well, then let's talk about it. Let's incorporate it in a paper and really try to challenge it. Because I think those are important in terms of, again, trying to falsify some of the information that may or may not be within your truth. In this case. And so, again, they're very important. So, when we think of masculine traits, for in this instance here, it's the ideology of interrupting. It's the ideology of taking up space. Whereas more feminine traits in this case, through, again, research proposals, are listening and turn-taking within conflict or persuasion, maybe expressing emotions in this case, maybe smiling in this case. Again, these are considered these gender norms that people can be raised with. And are they inherently true? Maybe, maybe not. Again, that's something to discuss. That's something to talk about. And maybe also the consideration of, these are maybe one or two research studies. Maybe you want to do your own and say, I don't really see as many emotions within a feminine trait as I do masculine. Cool, let's talk about that then. The other thing we can talk about is within culture, and culture is very interesting, particularly in this area of the country. So a lot of us, obviously live or have lived in North Carolina at some point, and so we might sit there and say, what is it about the expression of manners that comes into play? We often talk about this in terms of a very Eastern type of communication. And I don't mean Eastern as in the Eastern United States, but I'm talking about a lot of Oriental mentalities of respect and communicating with respect to elders, communicating with respect to providing manners before we get into the argument itself. And this is something that I find myself getting into a lot of. I am very much into expressing pleasantries before we get into business. And I had a colleague of mine, she was from Wisconsin, that she would often come into my office and just start with business. And to some degree, I felt not wrong, but I felt like, a hi would be nice. I say that with my students. If my students come in and say, hey, do you have my test grade yet? Before they say anything, I usually kind of snarkily come back and say, hi, how are you? Nice to see you. What's going on? How was your day? Just try to sneak in a pleasantry in this case. But this is, in many ways, could be considered, again, through the way that we're raised, could be a very Southern mentality. And again, if you don't see it, then that's something that's really cool to explain why that may be different. And so Western cultures in general, this is kind of moving towards individualistic nations like ourselves, we talk about things like implied messages, trust and intuition, verbal communication. So again, focusing on the argument. Tasks are separate from relationships. I can't tell you how many times one of my supervisor would get in a fight with somebody during one of the jobs I used to hold, and one person would be extremely upset, and she would go, business. I'm not taking anything personally. So, the fact that somebody's upset, I'm really sorry that they're upset, but this is business in this case. So that task was separate from the relationship. And it really was interesting because, and I adored this person just because she was one of those that I could feel really bad at something just because I wasn't doing my job. But, 20 minutes later, it's a whole different ballgame and a different perspective within the relationship because she said, it's business. I'm upset at the fact that you didn't do something that you were supposed to do, but this doesn't hinder our friendship or our relationship or anything. And, usually afterwards, we'd all on Fridays go out and maybe get a drink together as, our particular division within this company, and we'd get along great again. Again, it'd just be business in this case. In Western cultures, we'd focus a lot on facts, data, stats, to really emphasize these notions of, what makes truth in this case. But again, that's what's something that's really interesting within, again, Southern culture in particular is, again, those manners are so important within everything else. So, when I try to talk with my parents, for instance, a lot of this is still that mentality of respect thine elders when you're making these arguments, because otherwise some of this can be a little difficult in the sense of communicating your argument with another person. So these are all things to think about. And I hope I'm not generalizing or underselling anything here. If I am, that's something I would love for you to hear your argument in terms of what you perceive in this case, what you feel in terms of what I've been saying versus what the research has been saying, which I hope I keep those really, really close in terms of what I say versus the research says. But, that's something for your third reflection paper. That's something for your final paper in terms of phenomena that might have to do with persuasion that may or may not be something that I talked about and maybe not match up with the research. So, again, that's all part of it. I hope you take away something from this because, again, I think this is a really important chapter. But I also think Thursday will be a lot of fun, too, when we talk about cognitive dissonance. In terms of some of the stories that go along with it. And then, how we communicate as culture within this case. So we'll talk about the model then too. So that's it for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day. It's beautiful outside out here. I hope it is where you are. And I guess I will see you on Thursday then. So have a great day.